Okay, so today we're going deep on executive orders and like their immediate impact on the economy.
Uh-huh.
And specifically, we're going to be looking at some claims that were made by Vance
Okay.
just 5 days into President Trump's presidency.
Oh, wow. So early.
Yeah, in an interview on Face the Nation with Margaret Brennan.
Yeah, I remember that one.
So the big promise was lower prices for consumers.
Right.
But, the question is, was that really going to happen?
Exactly.
So Vance argues in this interview that those early executive orders are already in just those first few days starting to bring jobs back and are going to lay the groundwork for eventually driving prices down.
Mm.
His focus is on raising wages so people can afford everyday essentials.
I see.
That makes sense, right?
Well,
At least in principle.
yeah, I think what's really interesting here is that Vance is sort of highlighting this tactic that politicians often use, which is to promise a quick fix for a problem that's actually very complex.
Right.
And so he acknowledges that, there's a time lag, that prices will eventually come down, but it's going to take time.
Uh-huh.
But, economic systems are not like light switches. You can't just turn them on and off.
Right.
Job creation, even if it happens very rapidly, doesn't instantly translate to like cheaper milk and bread.
Right. And Margaret Brennan really, was pressing him on this.
Yeah,
And I think that was smart of her to do that.
it was.
Because, a lot of times politicians get away with just making these vague promises.
Yeah.
But she kept bringing it back to those everyday consumer goods like eggs and bacon, things that people buy all the time.
The things Vance himself mentioned in his campaign.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. She was basically saying like, okay, where are these mythical price drops?
Right.
Because my breakfast is still costing me an arm and a leg.
Yeah. And this is where the disconnect becomes really clear. I think Vance is looking at the long game, right?
Right.
He's focused on the eventual outcome.
Yeah.
While Brennan is more concerned with the immediate impact. So he's talking about how these policies will eventually trickle down to Main Street.
Mm-hmm.
But she wants to know what's going to happen to her grocery bill right now.
Right. And I think that's a valid question to ask.
Absolutely.
Because, a lot of people are struggling to make ends meet.
Yes.
And they need release now.
Right.
Not 5 years from now.
Exactly. And this is where those competing timelines really clash. And it gets even more complicated when you consider that not all of those initial executive orders were directly related to the economy.
Right. And that was something that Brennan also pointed out.
Yeah, I mean, they campaigned on the economy.
Yeah.
And then some of the first things they do are about things that don't seem to be directly related.
Yeah. It's kind of like promising a rock concert and then you get a poetry reading.
Right, exactly.
But Vance's counter-argument to that is where I think things get really interesting.
Okay.
He argues that even those seemingly non-economic orders are economically significant in a way. It's a kind of a ripple effect, he suggests. Like, for example, let's say you have an executive order about immigration. It may not directly change the price of, a gallon of gas.
Right.
But it could influence the labor market.
Yeah.
Which could then impact, production costs.
Right.
And eventually consumer prices.
So he's basically saying that everything is interconnected.
Exactly.
Even if the connections aren't immediately obvious.
Right. And I get that, like in theory.
Yeah.
But it seems like it would be really difficult to actually measure the impact of any one policy.
Absolutely. It's a huge challenge for economists.
Because if everything affects the economy, isn't it all just one big, economic soup?
It kind of is, yeah.
Right. And so how do you isolate the effects of a single ingredient?
Exactly. And that brings up another really important point, which is the role of expectations.
Okay.
Because even if those price drops aren't showing up immediately,
right,
the mere promise of them could affect how people spend money today. Do people tighten their belts waiting for those savings?
Yeah.
Or do they continue spending based on what they can afford right now?
That's a good question.
Yeah, it's this fascinating psychological dance between what we're actually experiencing and what we're hoping for.
Yeah, and it makes me wonder, how much weight do we put on the immediate versus the potential long-term impact of things?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah, and it's something that I think we all have to grapple with as consumers and as citizens.
Definitely.
Because we're constantly being bombarded with promises about the future.
Right.
But the present is what we're living in.
Absolutely.
So it's a tough balance to strike.
It is, and it makes you wonder if we're all just playing a giant economic game of chicken, waiting to see who blinks first.
Yeah, and in the end, who knows? Maybe those promised price drops will eventually arrive.
Maybe.
Or maybe there'll just be another political footnote in the grand economic saga.
Right.
I guess we'll have to wait and see. But in the meantime, it's something to think about.
Definitely food for thought.
Food for thought.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's all the time we have for today.
Okay.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
My pleasure.
And we'll see you next time.
See you later.